Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Sometimes I think of what it must have been like to experience films for the first time. Seeing the movies that we now consider undeniable classics with truly fresh eyes and free of the baggage and expectation that the so-called canon forces on us. I can't help but imagine audiences in 1960 being delivered not one, but two films of staggering hardcore genius. Two films that would terrify and revile them. Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the fourth episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers. I'm Anna Bogutska, your podcast host, and don't even try to make me pick between Norman Bates and Mark Lewis because I can't and I won't. In this jumbo-sized episode, I'm joined by two greats to discuss two classics. First up, podcaster and friend of the pod Becky Dark revisits Motel Bates with me as we dive into Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And one of my favorite video essayists, Izzy Custodio from the Be Kind Rewind channel, discusses Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. Both films are portraits of a serial killer with a terrible family history and uncontrollable homicidal urges. One of them was the biggest commercial hit for its director, while the other effectively ended its director's career and left him banished from the film industry. This episode will discuss both films in detail, so consider yourself warned. And if you enjoy this episode, please do give the podcast a little rating and maybe even a review. It really does help the show be discovered, or so the algorithm gods tell me. You can also see what other films I'm going to be discussing during this series over on our Letterboxd page, which I'll link in the show notes. And with all that said, please enjoy our take on Psycho and Peeping Tom. So, Rebecca.
Hello.
Hello. I want to know, did you have your own serial killer phase?
What? Me? Who? Me? I mean, you know, how close together do the murders need to be for it to technically be like a serial phase, you know? I mean, how sporadic can the habit be?
You know what I mean. Did you ever have a phase of your life? I think it's perhaps a spooky teenage rite of passage of becoming enthralled by real life killers or fictional killers, like the ones that I'm discussing this season.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever gotten out of my serial killer phase, Anna, to be honest. Like, yeah. I'm a real true crime junkie, and there's always been something about like real life serial killers that I've found. And, you know, I know that this isn't a particularly sort of idiosyncratic interest. Like, you know, serial killers do hold such a fascination for so many people. So I've always had that kind of that fascination with like real life serial killers for one reason or another. And, you know, listen to a lot of true crime podcasts and watch a lot of documentaries and stuff. And that will kind of even span from like, I guess, you know, the sort of everyday serial killer, like right up to kind of like cults and things like that. So and then like just sort of like multiple murderers and things. Like I just find it so darkly fascinating. And then in terms of like film and fiction, definitely Definitely. Like, I think out of all of the sort of subgenres of horror, that kind of serial killer, psychological thriller kind of
Venn diagram.
yeah, exactly. That sort of crossover is something that I've always really gravitated towards in my horror films. And yeah, like Psycho that we're going to talk about today has always been like right up there.
Oh, I know. I think we're similar in many ways, and this is one of them. I've also not exited my serial killer phase, although when putting together this list of films and TV shows, I've been careful to not indulge in too many serial killer biopics because I have a lot of issues with them. And there is this cottage industry of serial killer media that is fascinating in its own right, and how they fictionalize this. And the film we're going to talk about, in a way, is a weird one because it is both. It goes hand in hand with a very real murderer that happened, that existed, Ed Gein, but the novel was written without the knowledge of who he was, but the similarities were quite eerie when his crimes were revealed and Psycho, the novel, came out. But heading straight into the story itself, can you tell me, when did you first encounter this film? And also, did you know about the twist going in, or did you not?
So I encountered it really early. Hitchcock has always been a favourite of mine, and I would have been watching like Rear Window and North by Northwest, and those kind of the thrillers, but not necessarily the ones that like tip more over into horror. I would have been watching those really young. So my mum was a huge Hitchcock fan. And, things like Rear Window and Dial M for Murder, we'd kind of pop on of a Sunday afternoon, a sort of rainy Sunday afternoon, let's stick on some Hitchcock. And then I sort of started watching horror relatively young. I was probably 10 or 11 when I was starting to watch things like Silence of the Lambs and Amityville Horror, and the more kind of like it tended to be more kind of like occult and ghosts, and then like serial killer stuff. And I don't know like why that is sometimes a bit more of a like gateway into horror. I don't know if it's like the sort of realism that comes along with it. Maybe some of the more like psychological thriller type films, this can be seen as a bit more sort of prestige, even though there's still like really gross, like horrifying stuff happening on screen. I mean, I know that one of the reasons I would have watched Silence of the Lambs so early is because like my parents would have kind of deemed that as like an acceptable film for like a younger me to be, watching.
Totally. And also because I guess, this is one of the things that is kind of the running questions for me as I'm watching all of these films for this series, is like, why are these films sort of the acceptable face of horror, even though they are all very often go hand in hand with true crime and kind of very real life atrocities and terrible human evil? And I think, and this will evolve as I go on, I think it's because it's the crime element that is more acceptable, because it's such a clear definition of who's the bad guy, but also there is a mystery to be solved. Yes. And the detective, be that Clarice Starling or whoever, is the audience surrogate trying to solve that mystery. It's like, how did they did it? How did they do it? Who are they? How did they get away with it? How do we catch them? How do we prove they did it? Because we know they did it. And a lot of these kind of, the detective figure is kind of completely interlinked with the serial killer figure as well.
I think that is such a good point, and it's not something that I'd ever really kind of thought about, but like I think about the other stuff that my parents used to watch when I was a kid, and they were watching Inspector Morse and Miss Marple and Poirot and all of that kind of thing, which obviously week on week on week is murderers. You know, it's like violent death, but it's almost got this kind of like sort of respectable sort of tea time sheen to it. And then I guess if you're then sort of expanding that into like horror cinema, it's a smaller step from something like Waking the Dead to the Silence of the Lambs than it would be from like Waking the Dead to, I don't know, The Exorcist or whatever, you know. So it's almost this kind of like stepping stone. And I think in the UK there is a real kind of tradition of those like detective like crime shows that have been on, you know, the BBC and ITV and things like that you would just like sort of pop on back in the day when there weren't that many channels. So yeah, that's really interesting. But with Psycho specifically, like, you know, obviously kind of going from being a Hitchcock fan anyway, and then my interest in horror kind of germinating quite early. The Birds and Psycho were two films that I started watching like on repeat really like early.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And again, like there's this sort of like, they're horror, but there's this sort of quiet like classiness to them in some ways. And Hitchcock is like, you know, he's kind of like sleazy and grimy in his own way, but at the same time like in a bit more of that sort of like thriller approachable way. And so yeah, Psycho was an early discovery for me. And in terms of the twist, I've been thinking about this, been racking my brain, and I can't remember if I knew or not the first time I saw it, because I saw it so early. But it's an interesting thing, this thing with the twist with Psycho, because there's almost like there's more than one twist. You know, there's this twist about Marion, and you know, you think the film is about her, but then it's not about her, it's about him. And then you obviously get the twist of like, oh, mum's doing the murders all the way through the film, but then, oh no, it's not mum, it's Norman. And like, yeah, it's such a kind of multi-layered, and that idea of this kind of mystery that you talk about is so like at the heart of it.
It's interesting. You are completely correct. There's more than one twist in the film, and all of them kind of come by surprise. But I asked that because I remember watching Psycho for the first time, very much kind of in my self-guided education through the canon, right? And it wasn't my first Hitchcock, but I already knew that Norman was the killer.
Right.
So I already like went into this film knowing that he was the menacing figure, he was the murderer. And I remember the only time I experienced someone watching Psycho without any prior knowledge of any of the twists was with my ex. And I spent the entire running time watching his face being like, I cannot believe I get to see a person in the year 2000 something seeing this film from 1960 with a completely blank slate. It feels almost unbelievably rare, because it's become such a huge thing. I mean, for all the right reasons, that you kind of know the story before you watch it, which I think completely changes the relationship with the film, right? And I remember his face when it was revealed that it was Norman, that the mother was dead, and that it was Norman who was the killer. It hit as much as, you know, to put it in contemporary terms, as the twist at the end of Saw, which I'm not going to say in case someone has not experienced Saw from 2004, go and watch it. It shall be covered later on in the season. But I was like, this is beautiful. This is what Hitchcock wanted in 1960. And I'm seeing this now. It was like a little time capsule almost.
That's amazing. And you're right, like that moment in the film where it gets revealed that the mother has been dead, it's like I think I almost forget that you don't find it out when Norman like bursts into the fruit cellar at the end. There's actually an earlier moment when Sam and Lila are talking to the sheriff.
Yes.
And he says, well, Norman Bates's mother has been dead and buried in Greenlawn Cemetery for the last 10 years. And you go, like, your stomach drops. It's like, well, then who the fuck's he been talking to?
Yeah.
You know,
Is there another mother?
Yeah, it's like, holy shit, like that moment is such a like rug pull.
So you're a Hitchcock fan. So where do you think Norman Bates stands in the lineage of Hitchcock killers, as well as kind of wider cinema?
Yeah, Norman he's such a kind of singular antagonist in a lot of ways, because you get to know him so well. Like some of the other films, you know, like the sort of more procedural ones, because it is a procedural to a certain point, Psycho, but often you're much more placed kind of with the detectives in a procedural kind of serial killer film. But you get to spend so much time with Norman, interacting with, you know, Marion, hearing him interact with his mother, interacting with like Arbogast and Sam and people like that. And he's kind of likable, and, you know, he's quite a sort of pitiable character. And a bit sort of pathetic, and a bit sort of awkward. And you get to sort of spend quite a lot of time seeing him interact with like the murders that are happening around him that you don't necessarily know is him from the get-go. And so he's this very sort of complicated figure. Whereas if you look at a film like Frenzy, for example, which is obviously much later in Hitchcock's career and looking at Hitchcock's killers much later, that like disposes with any sense of like decency and restraint. Like you at least get from Norman this idea that there is... because he sort of goes into this fugue state, I guess, like when Mother takes over and is doing the killings, and he has this sort of amnesiac thing. But, you know, there's a horror from him when he is like encountering Marion's body and things. And you don't get that with like later examples in stuff like specifically like Frenzy, which is just so kind of like out and out brutal. So I think there's this sort of like restraint, I guess, with Norman Bates. And then in terms of like where he kind of sits like amongst serial killers in general, like he's relatively early, and sort of, I guess, becomes a bit of an archetype for especially killers who have like they've got a kind of mental illness. So obviously he's spurred on by the kind of ghost of his dead mother. And if you think about characters like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho or like Frank from Maniac, who have got these sorts of, you know, they're talking to other people, they've got this kind of this sort of almost like external force that's kind of like forcing them to do these like unspeakable acts. And, you know, Norman's a really early example of that, but he's also this example of taking horror from being, you know, Dracula and Frankenstein and the sort of monsters to it being like the monster next door. So this idea of like horror kind of coming to the neighborhood, this quiet, friendly, unassuming man next door who's doing these like horrible things.
I think you're very right. And there's also this element of not just the, you know, when we'll talk about the influence on kind of the mentally ill serial killer later on, but I think there's this almost innocence about him. And I think this has a lot to do with Anthony Perkins, his performance, his looks, who he was in Hollywood at that time. But because if you don't know the twist, if you don't know that it's actually about, the film is actually about Norman Bates, you go in and he's just this kind of kooky, slightly odd creature, but he is so quietly menacing. It's a film that perhaps more than any other kind of merits rewatching because he's there in plain sight. He's there under the guise of all of the niceties, all of the things that we're told are kind of the correct and polite and nice things to do. He is respectful, he's friendly, he's helpful. He has an almost childlike thing about him, the way he eats his candy, the way that he volunteers a sandwich, the way he talks about his hobby. And then I was watching this film the other day and I was just transfixed, particularly in the first scenes where we meet Norman, and how Hitchcock stays on just the smallest little movements that show us how not just kind of the fugue state or excusing all of his actions because of his disorder or mental illness. And I almost don't want to use the language that they used in 1960 because we've gone a long way since then.
We have.
Yeah. But when Marion arrives and she signs in with a fake name, and he then, when she leaves, he turns the book and looks at her name. And then when he's about to give her one key, he hesitates and gives her the key to the room that has the peephole. There's like these little things where I'm like, you're not in a fugue state right now, my guy. There is menace in him that is, I think, a genuine part of Norman and is not the Norman that is controlled by Mother.
Absolutely.
And I think the Anthony Perkins of it all. And I think in the novel, he's sort of a 40-year-old, balding, middle-aged man who drinks a lot.
Yeah.
But this Norman is he's almost like a little boy who happens to be very tall. He
is a tall drink of water.
He really is, and you know what? I'm not above thirsting over a gay man from 1960.
No, me neither.
But the fact that he is so boyish looking and so kind of inoffensive looking makes him, I think, even more eerie as a presence, even before we get into the whole Mother thing. What do you think Anthony Perkins brings to the role that no one else could?
I was watching one of the like a documentary of kind of like Talking Heads documentary about other filmmakers talking about Psycho, and Clive Barker, when he's talking about Anthony Perkins, talks about it as like almost like a glamour. So it's more than he's just good looking. Mm-hmm. He's almost this, and as you were sort of saying about where he was in Hollywood and him being this very handsome man, but it's beyond that. And there's such an interesting sort of juxtaposition there because there's nothing glamorous about Norman's life.
No.
But there's this kind of, again, like he's attractive and there's not just the way he looks, but even though he's sort of pitiable and sort of boy-like, he's, as you say, he's polite and he's welcoming. And serial killers, you need that to kind of bring your victims close to you. It's no good being an out-and-out psychopath that everybody can see from a mile off. You need to kind of almost like set these traps for people and bring them into you and lull them into a full sense of security. And I think that's something that Anthony Perkins really brings to Norman. And yeah, you're right, like he's so the casting is really interesting because in the book Norman Bates is this like overweight alcoholic. He's got big thick glasses and he's painted as being unsympathetic.
Yeah.
But I think what you need to make it believable is that people trust Norman, and Anthony Perkins brings that. And Arbogast says at some point, he says something like, we're always quickest to doubt somebody who has a reputation for being honest. And there's something there as well. Like there's something about him being this unassuming character, but what's just underneath.
And I think it's interesting you use the word trust, because I was thinking more like dismiss.
Interesting.
Because
Yeah.
and I particularly want to hear what you think about the way that Norman behaves and, you know, interacts with other people, particularly how he interacts with men versus women. Because I thought there was so much, I mean, you know, work class performance, iconic, blah, blah, blah. We know this, but there's so much nuance in the moments where Norman is talking to other people, as well as the scenes with Marion. So kind of, did you notice, so kind of how do you think that his demeanor changes depending on who he's talking to?
Yeah, I mean, with the men, with Arbogast and with Sam specifically, like he's much more kind of like defiant and aggressive, and I can't quite put my finger on kind of where he stands in terms of like the gender of who he is interacting with, but he obviously feels threatened by the men, whereas he is very much the threat when it comes to Marion. And there's this kind of, like I say, this sort of defensiveness when it comes to the men, whereas with Marion and his interactions with her, he's much more kind of placating. And even when you get that incredible switch when she talks about putting mother someplace,
yes.
And he just like, there's this turn, and again like the body language says so much. Like he sits forward in his seat, he's suddenly much more kind of aggressive and menacing, he's absolutely unblinking. And then he almost kind of realizes what he's doing. You see it kind of pass, and he sits back, he relaxes, his face relaxes, and he sort of almost realizes that he needs to dial it back. Like, you know, you've gone too aggressive with this woman, and you can see it in Janet Leigh's eyes that she is suddenly afraid of him, and he realizes, right, I need to dial this back because I'm going to lose her.
I think there's something so interesting in that, you know, the placating and the defensiveness, particularly because and it's different with Arbogast and Sam, because with Sam, he almost gets like peacocky in a way. And kind of like he doesn't, you know, puff his chest, but he comes as close as possible to that. He's curt, his voice has a different cadence to it. He's much more almost like stretching himself out so that he can appear even taller than he is, so he can loom over Sam. And with Arbogast, it's a lot more friendly but defensive once he clocks that he's investigating Marion's disappearance. And obviously at this point, you know, there is the element of he thinks he is covering up mother's murder as opposed to his own. So there is that defensiveness kind of is understandable in the sense that he's protecting his mother as opposed to just covering up his killings. But I find it really interesting how he then speaks to Marion's sister as well. There is that same sort of allure or change of demeanor, and then the way that he kind of wants to be more inviting, and the way that he wants to portray himself as smaller and more unthreatening, especially even physically, you know, sitting down, doing, you know, offering to change the sheets, to make her dinner, to kind of be protective and welcoming, to kind of be almost this like, I'm not a regular guy, I'm a nice guy type of vibe, where and making himself physically smaller so that he doesn't seem as imposing to someone who is like a petite woman on her own in the middle of the night in a motel with a strange tall man.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, again, like these there's like something calculating about it all. You know, you might think that he is this kind of simple motel owner, but actually there's so much kind of intent there in terms of the way that he, you know, you say about like him deciding to put her in room 1 and things like that. You know, come back to the parlor. Let's, you know, don't like, let's, it's too kind of official, kind of out in the office, like come back to the parlor. And, you know, she's there and she's got like all of those, it's such a like den of horror with all of that taxidermy like all around her, kind of looming down on her. And obviously, you know, that is so much about kind of him looking at her, him looking down, him being this threat, him about to pounce. And there's so much kind of like subtlety there. It's amazing.
And what do you think, you know, let's talk a little bit about Marion, because we do spend the first third of the film with her. And it's supposed to be her story, but then it isn't. What do you think about Marion appeals to Norman?
Yeah, I think he sees her as somebody else who is trapped to a certain extent. You know, she is spinning this tale, but not particularly convincingly. You know, whether he's got kind of other things on his mind or not when it comes to her, like even if he was just, you know, another motel owner, she's not doing a great job at kind of painting this picture. And it's quite obvious that she is hiding something. And I wonder if, you know, there's something there about, he can tell that she's dishonest and she's got something to hide like he does. And if she's on her own, if she's on the run, if she's got something to hide, like, does that make her an easier victim to a certain extent, you know? And I think there's something sympathetic there, empathetic there about her being sort of, you know, they're both very sort of 1960, they're both very polite and proper, but, you know, he can obviously tell that there's something deeper and almost kind of like transgressive about her.
And we also know that they're not that proper, because when in the very first scene is Marion enjoying some middle of the day hanky panky during her lunch break with her boyfriend.
Yeah, I know. So, like, that's so like, it's quite a risque, and it's quite a bold move from Hitchcock to, you know, open with it. You know, she's in her underwear, she's having this affair in the middle of the day. It's very passionate, you know. I believe that heat between her and Sam in this sort of tryst that they're having, and, you know, so we already know that about her. We know that she wants to be proper. You know, she's trying to sort of say to Sam, like, this is the last time, you know, I want you to come over and let's have dinner with my sister, with my mum's picture on the wall and all of that.
Let's make it proper. Let's make it official.
Yeah, exactly. And she kind of sees the money that she then steals almost as, I think, this step towards propriety. But obviously what she's actually done is skewed herself even more off of propriety and put herself in, like, you know, real danger because of it, because she has to go on the run.
I think I saw this video essay. I've been watching kind of a lot of video essays about the film, surprisingly few out there on the YouTubes. And one of them really kind of said that they're sort of a mirror image of one another, even by the way that Hitchcock sometimes shoots them, you know, kind of center frame, close up, with them looking at the camera in exactly the same way. And I think I've never before seen kind of how the attraction to Marion is so perhaps motivated by seeing a mirror of himself in her, being someone with who is hiding in plain sight, hiding in a politeness, like you say, hiding kind of in this attractive package that doesn't quite correspond with how they see themselves.
Yeah.
You know,
and with their behavior. Yeah.
Totally. And Marion obviously is going on this whole kind of, she's stolen this huge amount of money from her bosses on the run, and this amazing scene when she's driving and she's hearing essentially like all of these intrusive thoughts as she's driving about what people are going to be saying about her, what's going to happen down the line, all the consequences of her rash decision. And it's very like Norman's intrusive thoughts as well, which obviously take the shape of mother, of that figure. But it is, I think, one of the more unspoken elements of the film, of how much Marion and Norman parallel one another.
Yeah. And you're right about like those moments, especially when she's in the car and like she's framed so dead center, close up. And like with Norman, you know, you're talking about like his little almost like sort of like micro expressions and things, you know. Anthony Perkins has such an amazing face to kind of convey what's going on deeper without actually saying anything. And you get so much of that with Janet Leigh as well in that scene in the car, where some of the thoughts are about like the kind of cowboy guy, the guy who has bought this property for his daughter and the money is really his, and he's sort of saying something like you know, can you believe like she was flirting with me? And she gets this little like smile on her face, like she's happy that she's kind of, you know, this guy who was obviously kind of being quite inappropriate to her in the workplace, and she's got this little smile of like, she's happy that she's kind of gotten one over on him.
Yeah.
And on, you know, on kind of the system, you know, she's excited by it. Of course she is. And like those, you're right, that kind of mirroring of us kind of being inside her head. And then you kind of don't get that with Norman. You get this external thing inside his head, because actually, obviously, until the end of the film, we're supposed to believe that that's mother like actually shouting at him, but of course it's all just inside him.
So let's talk about the other woman in the picture, Mother. How does Mother manifest, and what does she mean for Norman?
Oh God, like she's so like cruel, you know, like she's this extremely domineering figure that looms like the house above the motel, you know. She looms over Norman, she looms over this film. And it's like there's just this real kind of like ugliness to the way that he hears her, and you can only imagine, and actually, you know, if you watch some of the sequels, you find out more about her when she was alive, but you can only kind of imagine like what she would have been like to him when she was alive, to kind of make him so like he's afraid of her, but at the same time, like he feels indebted to her, he feels guilty. Like there's so much kind of like baggage that is just like weighing over him the whole time. Like he doesn't seem to be able to kind of, well, he can't exist without her. And he talks about her in these very kind of hateful ways, you know. He says, I don't hate her, I hate what she's become. He hates the illness, this idea that she is kind of mentally unwell. But at the same time, you know, you understand that there's this sort of like slightly untoward kind of relationship, this idea of like the boy's best friend, like a boy's best friend is his mother.
Yeah,
like that's such an odd thing to say.
It's a fucking red flag if I ever saw one. Jesus.
Right, exactly. And she's this is it. Like she's just such a huge, domineering, like looming presence over him. And then it's not like she's sort of coddling him and stuff. Like along with that is just this cruelty and this like ugliness.
Well, there's also this sort of desire to, I mean, everything you're saying is on point. There's also this almost desire to contain her in a way that he can manage that mistreatment. And I think kind of the stuffed birds are part of that, he doesn't like the killing. He just likes the stuffing and the arrangement of these creatures around him. So he can be surrounded by these constant dead things, these that are looking at him and looking over him, but they can't actually give him any love, any understanding, nothing in return. It's completely one-sided. And you might say it's very only child behavior, and sure, it is, but I do find it's the thing that makes him deeply sad, that all of that obsession, all of that mistreatment, all of that terrible language that she flings his way has been so deeply internalized that even once she's gone, and, we're told the initial story is that Norman kills her and her husband or her lover while they're in bed in a kind of in a jealous rage, in a jealous blackout. He poisons them. But the fact that he wants to keep her, and that he wants to keep not just her body, but her mind and her abuse alive is so much more telling than the killing.
Yeah.
Because that's just continuating the reality in which he's been forced to exist. And he will do anything to perpetuate that. And that is so, it's very tragic. And I think that's one of the things that has kind of, we've latched onto culturally, of finding this tragic skeleton key for a serial killer's actions as almost a way to try and feel for them, because we cannot comprehend what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And isn't it interesting that, because I think you could hear the way that she speaks to him, the way that she tries to control his kind of his relationships with other people and his kind of interaction with the outside world. She's so she doesn't want him talking to these women and she's kind of constantly controlling his actions, and you would almost believe that would be why he'd killed her, all of these years of abuse, that one day he just snapped and he couldn't take it anymore, and so he killed her. But that's not why. You understand that actually it was a jealousy thing over the lover, and so he killed both of them. And then you're right, he then recreates her by preserving her body, keeping her physically present, and then rather than recreating her in his mind as this kind of loving presence, that he'd kind of killed the abuser, and he's sort of recreated something else in his mind so that he can still have her around as the mother that he'd always wanted. He recreates her as the abuser. And it goes so far to sort of, you think oh, this isn't a guy who had been pushed too far by this awful woman and so he killed her. It's no, he killed her for other slightly more concerning reasons, and then he's recreated her in that way, that she's kind of always been in his life. It's it's sad and deeply disturbing.
And there is that physical element of him wanting to be helpful, wanting to be, for lack of a better expression, wanting to be a good boy, where I think that the body of Mother kind of plays that role, where he will move her around from basement to the bed, or just keep her with her dress on, with her wig on. There's an element of he's taking care of her even after she's dead, because he wants to continue trying to prove to her that he is good. And that is just devastating to watch. But also, then that has been transformed into this very predatory nature that he displays, like I was talking about before. He makes choices that have very little to do with Mother's influence when Marion comes in. And as I was watching, my favorite scene in the film, and we'll talk about the murder scenes in a minute, but I think you mentioned it before, the scene when he's having dinner with Marion and he's just watching her, and he shifts so many registers in just that one scene. The way that his body moves, the surrounding with the birds and stuff. And you know that famous quote by Hitchcock where he said that the way to create tension in movies is to put a bomb under the table and you show the audience the bomb and they know that that is the threat. The threat of explosion is there. And I think the entire movie, Norman is the bomb under the table because we know that something is wrong. And after Marion gets killed, we've already seen the explosion. It's just nobody else has put two and two together yet.
Yeah, that's right. He is this kind of... I really liked what you've kind of picked up on about the stuff that he does that isn't influenced by Mother, because I think so much, you know, when you think about the film, because it is kind of the big twist, this idea that he's like, you know, he's in these fugue states, it's Mother that's actually doing it, and Norman is almost this kind of like patsy kind of, you know, just sort of
almost like a victim.
Victim himself. But you're right, like, you know, him kind of putting Marion at her ease, lulling her into a false sense of security, making sure she's in cabin number 1 with that he can, you know. And this is the other thing that about her being appealing to him. Of course, she's beautiful, which appeals to his like peeping Tom side of things. Like, you know, he wants to be able to look at her, this voyeurism that Hitchcock is always kind of exploring in his films. And here it's such explicit voyeurism. You know, he is literally like put her in a place where he can watch her unseen. And it's all of those moments that, as you say, this idea of the kind of ticking bomb, you get that from early on. And then in the latter part of the movie, when it has shifted to much more being Norman's film, or rather you realise that you're watching Norman's film, that the ticking bomb sort of becomes like, well, we've seen the explosion, but as you say, when's everybody else going to see it? You know, when's everyone else going to kind of catch up?
Do you think that Norman would have killed Marion even if he wasn't being, you know, possessed or dominated by Mother?
God, I don't know. I mean, the fact that he's already a murderer before Mother is, you know, he kills his mum, right, and her lover, and so it's not like she's died and she has, you know, in air quotes, possessed him, and therefore he is carrying out these murders. Like, that was off his own back straight away. So I mean, it's hard, but yeah, I think he probably would have. I think it's in him. I think he's very damaged.
I think so too. I think that would have happened, perhaps in a different way, but it would have happened. It's inevitable that we have to talk about the murders.
Yes,
but alongside the very famous shower scene, how does Hitchcock film Norman's murders?
Oh my God. Like, the thing that I think I picked up on it, watching it like for this chat, was just how like brutal the shower scene is, and later the killing of Arbogast at the top of the stairs. But the filming of it, even though it's very famously, you know, it's especially the shower scene, you know, it's a montage, it's flash cuts. You don't, you know, Hitchcock being this kind of master of creating this impression that you've seen things that you haven't, and so, you know, your brain is kind of filling in the gaps, whether that is Marion's nudity or whether it is a knife going into skin, you know, all of which you don't really see. There is still something so like, it's shocking. Like, you know, you've got the just natural sound of the shower, And then obviously that Bernard Herrmann sort of strings comes in during the attack, and then it goes back to quiet and you just hear the shower and this kind of deafening quiet that overcomes the bathroom at that point. And it's disorienting, you know, that sound coming in, the score coming in. It's so sudden and like violent, and the camera work, the cuts, the editing, the montage style, every kind of cut between each shot feels like a cut of the knife, and you just feel so kind of attacked yourself. Like the scene feels like an attack on the audience.
It's so assaulting. I think you're completely spot on in everything, because I too was surprised by how aggressive that scene is. And you know, Hitchcock is notorious now for his quite aggressive forms of directing to get that reaction out of people. But I think here, obviously, the editing, the music, the sound design of it all does such a huge portion of it, because we only do see these just snippets. These small glimpses of flesh, of a knife, of blood, which is obviously black, in this movie, and kind of that stark white background with the blackness of the blood makes it so weirdly much more intense than if it was in color. And by the time it's over and you just hear that Norman scream of mother somewhere in the background and him rushing back, there is it seems like such a long pause. I don't think it's more than, you know, a handful of seconds, but it feels like a full minute or two between the murder happening and Janet Leigh's Marion dying and Norman finding her body.
Mother! Oh God! Mother! Blood!
And what actually surprised me the most this time round was just how much time we spend on the cleanup.
Yes.
Like, he actually spends so much more time filming Norman's cleanup than he does filming the murder. The murder is like seconds, really. And there's a beautiful documentary by Alexander Philippe, the filmmaker, which is dedicated to basically the shower scene. And its impact, its influence, it's the reaction of contemporary and modern filmmakers to it. But I was really struck by the amount of detail that we see of Norman putting the body away, cleaning everything up, really putting some elbow grease into the cleanup. It's almost more grotesque than the murder itself, and I don't know why.
I know, the bit where he just so kind of matter-of-factly like wraps her dead body in the shower curtain. It's so practical. Like it's chilling. And obviously then you get the bit where he's got her in the car and takes the car to the swamp, and that is such an interesting moment in terms of the disposal of the body and his kind of approach to cleanup. Is you almost become complicit in it as the audience, because when the car pauses as it's sinking into the swamp, all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I'm watching this guy who was just brutally, or you know, we've just seen this woman brutally murdered, we're now watching this guy dispose of the evidence, dispose of this dead body of this woman who we have followed for half the movie up until this point, and now is just essentially meat. She's just been butchered in front of us. And why do I suddenly feel nervous that the car isn't going to sink all the way into the swamp? Like, it's such a playful moment by Hitchcock. This is one of the things that I've always loved about Hitchcock so much, is he's got such a wicked sense of humor. And there's something about that moment where the car pauses and you're like, holy shit, like, why do I care if he gets away with this?
I think it's because of the mystery, the thing we were talking earlier. You want to see something happens so that someone else can solve it. And it's obviously like I was saying before, the bomb under the table is then in front of us, because now we know exactly, or almost exactly, everything that's happened and how he's covered it up. And then we spend the rest of the film watching people try to solve it.
Yeah.
And I did want to ask you, kind of, obviously the Marianne's murder and her cleanup is incredibly striking even now, but also the killing of Arbogast, the reveal of Mother, kind of, there's so much inventiveness in this film. Which one strikes you the most even now?
I think for me, it's got to be Arbogast. Like that, because it's even shorter than the shower murder. Like, it's so sudden and it's over so quickly. And it's, again, this idea of it being like disorienting and kind of queasy, the way that, we are in this kind of God's eye shot as she comes out of the door to the right and slashes him, and then it's this sudden close-up on his face as the knife goes down his face, and then as you follow him down the stairs, and all you can hear is this like the kind of sound of his feet like going wrong, like as he's like falling backwards, the camera following him down, and like they used the same effect as they did on in Saboteur, when the guy like falls off of the Statue of Liberty, this kind of like queasy what's it called when you're afraid of heights?
Vertigo?
Vertigo, yeah. Vertigo. That other very famous Alfred Hitchcock film. How hilarious. Yeah, it like gives you a sense of vertigo as you kind of like follow him down the stairs. It's like it, you can feel it in your body, like you're falling yourself. It's almost that feeling of like when you're just falling asleep and you kind of step off of a curb in your dream and it like shakes you awake. For me, like that's got to be possibly even more affecting than the shower.
And I wanted to ask you as well about the Bates Motel and the Bates house, because I think I've never paid so much attention to it as I did this time round, and also then watching the sequels and the show Bates Motel, which I'll ask about in a second. But do you think that adds to the story and to the character of Norman?
Yeah, I do. Like, it's funny. It's this sort of juxtaposition again. I guess the motel itself, the cabins they're sort of squat and modern, and then you've got this huge like gothic like nightmare castle kind of up on the hill. The fact that she arrives in a storm, sort of seeking refuge, and he comes down from this like almost like huge gothic mansion. It is like this kind of flashback to Universal horror films, this gothic, this idea of this monster sort of up on the hill in his old castle, and then it kind of crashes into the modernity of the motel. And the script uses the motel so effectively and simply, I guess, to help kind of paint this picture of like the isolation. He keeps repeating this line of 12 vacancies, 12 cabins, 12 vacancies. You can all of the rooms are empty. He is sort of alone / with his invalid mother, crazy mother, kind of in this gothic castle up on the hill. And then you sort of come down to like real life almost in this sort of squat motel down sort of by the road. So yeah, I think the setting of it does a lot to kind of, like the birds in the parlour, it's just this looming presence all the time, and it makes you feel kind of small and overlooked and oh my God, like vulnerable.
Yeah. Yes, every single one of those words, Becky. Small and overlooked and vulnerable. That's baby Norman.
I know.
I know he's a killer, but I can't help but feel for him. And, moving on a little bit to the afterlife of the film, do you, we can jump over this if you don't want to go into, but like how the way that Hitchcock marketed the film has become quite infamous. How do you know how it was received at the time and how it was positioned?
Yeah, so critics surprisingly didn't love it. There were no previews of the film for critics, and I've heard kind of suggestions that maybe there's that some of the critical response after it was initially released was critics being like pissed off that they'd had to go and watch it just with like normal audiences at their local cinema, which I find hilarious
and also can relate.
Yeah, can relate 100%. But it, like, Hitchcock always said that he had made this for the audience, and audiences really loved it. And there are reports of people coming out, like sort of pouring out of cinemas after they've seen the film, kind of laughing in horror, like that kind of like almost like coming off of a roller coaster, that sort of adrenaline and like I don't know, like the sort of endorphins that you get when you sort of come off of a roller coaster or you've come out of this roller coaster movie.
I've also read that he didn't want to show it to critics in advance of the release because he had seen what had happened to Michael Powell with Peeping Tom, which was released just a few weeks before Psycho, I believe, or a few months.
That would make sense.
In the biopic of the making of Psycho called Hitchcock from 2012, where Anthony Hopkins plays Hitch, there's a whole montage where he basically lays out the marketing and release plan for the film and talks about all of these, the protecting the spoilers.
Yes.
Not letting anyone in to the cinema after the film had started.
Yeah.
And kind of getting all the cinemas on board with protecting the reveal, with almost locking people in so that they could be entirely focused on the film. And there's this great scene in another ways not so great movie where Hitchcock is just dancing to the sound of the screams outside of the cinema in the first screening of Psycho, and I just thought, like, you know what, if he didn't do that, I can absolutely see him doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, I love this idea so much because, this is back in the day when I think this is right, that, films would just show continuously in cinemas, so you could kind of show up and go in at any point, and you might be at the beginning of the film, you might be 20 minutes in, you might be 20 minutes from the end, and then if you hadn't seen the beginning of the film, you could just like wait there in your seat and just like almost watch it kind of back to front, so it was just like running the whole time. And this idea that Hitch was like, he was so adamant that the twists of the film weren't spoiled, and apparently people would come, there were sort of warnings on all of the like standees in the sort of auditoriums, and the kind of warnings that he would give, like at the beginning of the film, like don't spoil the end. People would come out of the film after, as you say, sort of almost being like locked in, and people in the queue would be like, what happened, and like, there was almost this sort of carnival feel of like, we're not telling, like you'll have to wait and see. Like, I just love the kind of the like spectacle around it, and like that extra kind of, we've been talking about mystery, this rabid fascination, and the just his approach to understanding how important saving audiences from spoilers were going to be for the way that they received the film.
I feel like if Hitchcock existed now and was not a filmmaker, he would have a video essay channel on YouTube where he ranted about spoiler culture a lot.
Yeah, would subscribe.
But, we know now that all of that paid off, that the film was a huge commercial success, the biggest one of Hitchcock's career. Where do you see Psycho's influence now? And I know it's such a mammoth question, so maybe where do you see its influence on kind of subsequent horror or psychological horror films?
Yeah, I mean, like, it has become, Norman Bates has become a bit of an archetype of serial killers. This idea of Hitchcockian, this approach to storytelling, of suspense, of thrill, of bringing the audience along with you, this idea of the bomb under the table, like almost kind of treating the audience as sort of co-conspirators. Like, I love all of that.
I love that.
And Hitchcock always had like such a very like particular point of view in his films. And John Carpenter once, I've heard him say that filmmakers borrow from Hitchcock, but nobody like carries the legacy, because he was so particular in the way that he made films and like told stories. But you sort of look at films like American Psycho, things like even Seven, Silence of the Lambs, even Saw, like these sort of mysteries and procedurals, and but always with this kind of this focus on the serial killer themselves. The narrative may be wider, but we talk about Silence of the Lambs and you talk about Hannibal Lecter, you talk about Saw and you talk about Jigsaw, and I feel like that is something that Hitch was sort of doing very early. Sort of, we've talked a little bit about Norman being sort of somewhat empathetic, and sort of this idea of bringing horror into the everyday. One of the things that I always think about serial killer films is this idea of sort of like gritty realism. They feel they're not supernatural, they're not occult. They are dealing with sort of real life horrors of what humanity can do to each other. And I think Psycho did that, super early, bringing horror into the everyday. And that is just something that has just continued and continued.
And do you think kind of the legacy or appreciation of the film has been changed by the expansion of the story and also by the revelations about Hitchcock's sleaziness, particularly around his actresses?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the continuing story, like I've seen the 3 sequels, which I love. It's one of those things where like how can sequels to Psycho, one of the most perfect films ever been made, like how can the sequels to that be good? Like, this is something that almost keeps me awake at night. I'm like, how is that possible? How is that possible? But like, I love 2, 3, and 4 in their own special ways. I think it's some sort of like magic that has like come along and sort of made that possible, that they're actually all worth a watch.
I think that magic is called Tony Perkins.
I mean, you've nailed it. You've absolutely nailed it. The fact that he kept coming back, and he's created Norman as the person that we follow through these films. And obviously he directed 2 or 3 did he direct?
Not 2. 2 is Richard Franklin.
Okay, so it's 3, and then Mick Garris did 4. But he's done so much to kind of make Norman this like enduring presence, I guess, through horror. I've never seen Bates Motel. Have you? Is it any good?
I have. So I'm watching all the sequels and completing Bates Motel because I'm gonna cover the Psycho sequels on the Patreon.
Amazing.
And I one of the things that I keep asking myself is like, does a Norman Bates expanded universe work? And like, do we want to know more about him? Or do we is it just because we enjoy the killings? Because actually, surprisingly, it's not so much about the murders, really. It's all about him. It's all about this one character.
Agreed. And in 4, you know, I that's such a it's such an interesting like approach to it as well, because you know it's much later in his life. He's been released and he's got a wife, and he's sort of he's on like a radio chat show, and then you get all these flashes back to like when his mum was alive and they used to live in the big house together, and like it's really camp, but again, like it's so watchable. And I think you're right, I think it's watchable because there's something about Norman that you want to like keep exploring, and you want to know more about him. Where did he come from? Like, why is he like this?
And I think, you know, I mentioned it earlier, but you know, thinking about Bates Motel as well, which ran for 4 years, and is a prequel to Psycho, and it's set in modern times. So there's like, it takes a lot of liberties which work, but it casts Freddie Highmore as young Norman. And I think that's an incredibly wise casting choice, because the thing about Norman that I think keeps us coming back is almost a certain maternal, regardless of whether you are maternal in real life or not, or whether you're a mother or not, or that doesn't matter. But I think the fact that we see these very baby-faced, boyish, lanky actors like Tony Perkins, like Freddie Highmore, not Vince Vaughn, but I will get to that when I cover the remake. I think this is one of the reasons why that remake doesn't work. It's because Vince Vaughn, you don't want to protect Vince Vaughn. You want to get the fuck out of his side. You do not want to see Vince Vaughn angry. You do not want to see Vince Vaughn like loom over you. But I think Tony Perkins and Freddie Highmore have this like very almost childlike quality, boyish quality that you cannot help but feel both unthreatened by and protective of. You know, even in the scene when, you know, that we spoke about earlier, that where Marion gently tries to maybe suggest that, hey, have you maybe thought about, you know, not living with your mother? You know, that's coming from a place of, oh, you know, you're trauma dumping on me, and maybe this would help. I don't know you guys. But the way, like, these kind of constant olive branches that other people give them, and the way that they switch is so near imperceptible that it's like discombobulating. So by the time you realize that they're menacing and that they're threatening, it's too late, because you've been kind of drawn on to this like, oh, you're so cute, you could never hurt anyone.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because in Psycho 4, young Norman is played by Henry Thomas, who, you know, at that time was probably best known for playing like Elliot in E.T. And again, like this kind of childhood fave, you know, this adorable little boy. Like if you've ever watched the audition tape of when he's auditioning for Elliot in E.T. With Steven Spielberg, and like the way that he like turns on the tears is just so heartbreaking, and again you just want to like sweep him up in your arms and just give him this great big hug. So again, like really amazing casting, even in like a trashy sequel like Psycho 4, you know, even then they're thinking about it, like how are we going to, again, this idea of sort of lulling you into a full sense of security with these boy-like actors.
Oh my gosh. Okay, any last thoughts about Norman Bates and Psycho before we wrap up, Becky?
I don't think so. I think we've done it. Just like, I just love it so much. I've got a Norman Bates tattoo on my arm. I love it that much. Like, it's just, I could not be happier that we've managed to have this chat.
I love this so much. Becky, thank you so much for doing this and
thank
for
you,
your
Anna.
time.
Do you know what the most frightening thing in the world is? It's fear. So I did something very simple. Very simple.
Izzy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this really fucked up movie.
Oh my God, my pleasure. I love talking about fucked up movies. So happy to be here.
Since it's it's not our first time recording together, but it's the first time doing the usual format of the podcast, recording together. So I have to ask you the question I ask of all of my contributors when they record with me for the first time. What is your personal relationship with horror?
You know, I am a horror late bloomer. For a long time, I was simply scared of the concept of horror movies. Like, I didn't understand why you would want to watch something that would make you feel scared. Like, I was like, why would I put myself in that position? That doesn't make sense. And so I just avoided them kind of on principle in the sense that I just thought they would scare me and therefore that is bad, which I think is not a good way to think about them at all. And I think what actually kind of pulled me out of it was seeing Halloween with one of my friends. And I sort of realized how many more dimensions it is. It's not just about being scared. It's not about putting yourself in a fearful mindset. There's so many layers to it. It's so political. It can be really funny. And since then, I've been trying to, I guess, catch up on the genre. So I wouldn't say I'm a horror aficionado, but I think I have a real curiosity for it that I've been really excited about exploring in recent years.
Horror curious.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm asking this as well of everyone who's guesting on this particular series. Did you have, you know, a serial killer phase or kind of a fascination with crime and killers?
You know, not really. I do enjoy murdery kind of movies, I guess. I mean, one of the foundational films to my love of movies is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which feels similar in this camp in a sense. Like, it's not a serial killer movie, but it is about like violence and the way violence is imposed upon people. So yeah, so I like them, but I've never had a phase where I'm like, I gotta listen to another true crime podcast or anything like that. Yeah. So yeah, I get a thrill, but it's not my genre of choice. Maybe, I don't know.
And you know, it's so interesting to think about Baby Jane as a murder movie, even though there is murder. Hadn't not thought about it that way. What do you think of then when you think of serial killers in the movies?
I guess just as a child of the 90s, I kind of go back to those kind of slasher films that like Scream was built on, you know? That's kind of my first instinct. But since then, I mean, I feel like as I've been catching up on the horror genre, I love seeing how far this stretches back and kind of how it seeps into film noir and New Hollywood and all of these, and of course into Michael Powell as well. So yeah, it's such a varied thing to me that I think I'm still working to understand like how diverse that subgenre is.
I mean, that's why I'm doing all of these episodes and rewatching or watching all of these movies for the first time, kind of trying to understand how they've been portrayed and how it's changed and how they all kind of drink from the same well of influences. One of them being Peeping Tom, another huge one being Psycho, which are the two films that I'm covering in this episode. So in that regard, when did you come across Peeping Tom, and do you remember your first impressions of it?
I actually just saw it for the first time really recently when it went on Criterion, because I'm a huge Powell and Pressburger fan. And I think Peeping Tom was like the one that I hadn't yet seen. And so when this version went up on Criterion, I was like, okay, I finally have to watch this. And I was just obsessed with it from the first minute I saw it. Just because I'm sure we'll talk about all of this, but I think as a meta statement, I guess, about filmmaking and what it does to a person to be a filmmaker. I absolutely was just captivated from the first minute. And of course, like the gorgeous visuals that Michael Powell usually puts in his film, I think are present here, although in a different way. So yeah, I just absolutely love it.
So kind of coming at it from a slightly different perspective, then you're a huge fan of Powell and Pressburger. This is just Michael Powell operating on his own terms. How does Peeping Tom sits within the legacy of their work together? You know, I know it's slightly iffy to talk about it, but there's such a huge creative partnership and so many emblematic films and such a huge influence. There was this huge retrospective at the BFI at the end of last year where they were screening all of these films, and they both had their own individual careers. Peeping Tom virtually ended Powell's career. Such was the vitriolic response to it. So where does Peeping Tom sit within that legacy of that huge creative partnership and them as filmmakers?
Well, I see it as sort of extending a lot of the themes that some of the Powell and Pressburger films also deal with. I mean, I think obviously The Red Shoes has a lot to do with art making and what art making does to a person, what obsession does to a person, the lengths someone is willing to go to create their own art. And Peeping Tom is, I think, in conversation with that film specifically about that subject, although I think in a much darker respect. I think there are also some obviously very creative and similar, or that Powell utilized in his other films. And I know that his touch was more on the directing end than Pressburger's for many of their collaborations together. So I think you see that a lot in Peeping Tom. I mean, you can watch someone watch a movie in Peeping Tom and it's never the same angle for very long. He always finds such strange kind of uncanny angles to capture a moment happening. And we see that throughout their filmography together. So I think it kind of extends some of the themes, but also I think you just see that very specific auteur type touch that Michael Powell brings to all of the Powell and Pressburger films.
There's like different threads in what you were just talking about that I want to pull out, and you know it's the different reads that the different entry points into this film, really, because on one hand it is sort of one of the foundational horror films. You know, it's no, between this and Psycho, it's so influential in the space of psychological horror or kind of, you know, serial killer horror, however you want to name it. It's also a film about filmmaking and a film about obsession and an obsessive personality and where they could lead them. Let's pull at the kind of the meta-ness of it all. It's a film about watching films and about making films. And there's this great line in it that I love, you know, when the woman says, "Take me to your cinema," which is so erotically charged in such a disturbing way. Kind of, how do you think, what do you think this film is saying about both watching and making films?
I'll talk about it from like kind of a personal perspective in the way that I was thinking about it. I think we kind of take for granted how profound an experience watching a film is, because obviously films are everywhere. They're so ever present, but what a vulnerable thing that we're exposing ourselves to kind of on a daily basis. Like the idea of watching someone unfold their psyche in front of you or be so vulnerable as to like be present in a character's worst moments in their lives. Like it is such a strange kind of voyeuristic act of watching a film. Like even if it's fiction, you know, you're just kind of bearing witness to something that is so profound all the time. And I think in some sense, like that is like an uncomfortable dynamic. It's not one that like I'm taking seriously or thinking like it's immoral to watch, you know, someone go through something. But I think it's strange, I'm sure, as a filmmaker to kind of understand that you are manipulating an audience as you're creating this film. You're manipulating their emotions and feelings and thoughts. you're manipulating their worldview, and you're also manipulating the person in front of the camera to kind of like mine all of their emotional capacity to like deliver something that you ask for. It's like a very powerful position and a very strange thing to be able to do. And so I would imagine that a director who is very fixated on the idea of obsession, and we see that again and again throughout his filmography, would be thinking about something like that and how it kind of eats away at him, I guess. And I know Martin Scorsese has talked about this film many times and kind of, I think, pulls a similar feeling from that, like the understanding of how voyeuristic it is and how controlling it is to kind of make a film and what that can actually do to a person. So to me, I was thinking a lot about making that and kind of what it must feel like to be Michael Powell and to go through that process. And then the second thing I was kind of thinking about with this film is kind of how we can all feel like that now. You know, we're all directors now. We're all filmmakers now. We have cameras in our pockets, and every day we are voyeurs of somebody else's lives. Every day, like, you are filmed, whether you film yourself or someone is filming you without your consent. Like, it just happens. How many times are there, you know, videos on TikTok that go viral of just some stranger doing something that seems a little off, and we discourse about it for days. And so, like, we're kind of reaching uncanny valleys in this dynamic in 2024. And that's what I think is makes this film so relevant all the time, that there's just this dynamic that's being kind of exploded and taken for granted and maybe even abused today. So yeah, it just caused so many like thoughts in me about what its historical implications are, what it means to an individual to make something like this, and also how it kind of reflects our day-to-day lives now.
You're pulling at something really interesting, because I sometimes try to imagine what it must be like to watch a film like this in the context of the time without having, you know, everything else that came since as a reference point. You know, we might watch Peeping Tom now and think like, oh, this is quite tame compared to the stuff that we've been exposed to in the horror genre, or even, you know, in other adjacent genres that have kind of taken from horror. But there is something deeply universal and timeless in this film. And I think you're tapping into this dual impulse as viewers, but also, as you say, as people now who have cameras in our pockets all the time, every single day of our lives. And
we're literally addicted to them.
Totally.
Like, scientifically proven to be addicted to them.
Totally. And you made me think, as you were talking, of, you know, this kind of often recycled image, which isn't just an image, it's a fact. This is what happens every single time you go to any sort of event. You know, if you go to a gig and you'll just see the sea of screens, tiny screens pointing at the same thing. Or you go to like a destination and it's just a lot of people queuing to take pictures of it, or tons of screens recording it. And there's this thing that I think Peeping Tom taps into, which is this desire to capture a piece of reality, to own it and to freeze it in time so that it cannot be corrupted. And obviously it's kind of filtered through this quite unstable character. But his impulse throughout the film is to capture something that cannot be captured by a camera.
Right.
And the other thing is, you know, the vulnerability of being completely in a film. It's something quite powerful that I think it's been diluted since screens have come to dominate our lives. You made me think of I was sitting in on an interview with the filmmaker Pedro Almodovar, and I was translating for him and when he needed, and there's something that he said about seeing Penelope Cruz on the big screen and kind of the experience of seeing kind of a movie star like that on a screen and wanting them to be as big as possible, to be kind of consumed by them. And I thought of that shot in Peeping Tom where Mark kind of lunges at the screen and tries to be almost eaten up by it, by this image of the woman on it, a woman that he killed. And I think it's very rare now to have that experience of pure sensory immersion in a movie. Be that because of how we're watching it, of how distracting other things are, how distracted we are by other screens and things in our lives. But I think actually emotionally it might have more to do with this kind of inability to be vulnerable in a space like that and with a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, again, thinking about it in a modern context, like so much of what we watch is meant to make us want to be somewhere else. You know, it's so escapist and it's so unreal all the time. So it's like never actually capturing reality. It's like always filtered, always manipulated. Yeah, and it does. I think it's funny because it does kind of make us, I think most studies have shown, feel badly. Like a lot of the things that we watch online and stuff like that. And what is so funny that I thought this film was saying again and again was there's always like a line every so often that's like, you know, all this filming is really bad for you, or, you know, or it's like, this is really sickening, you know. It's basically, I felt like I was being told to get off my phone every couple of minutes, you know what I mean? They were like, you really need to like get back and touch some grass, so to speak, you know.
And we've described Mark Lewis, the protagonist of Peeping Tom, as an obsessed character. Yeah. And how would you describe his obsession?
Wow, that's a hard one to describe. I think it's, in some sense, his obsession has so many layers to it. He's obsessed with filming. He's obsessed with capturing this emotion. He's obsessed with himself. He's obsessed with his past. He's obsessed with his fear. So much of his selection of victims, I think, has to do with his own fears about women, which I think somehow tie into his past. And it all goes to kind of like making this film, which I think somehow reflects his psyche and the way that he was raised. How would you describe it? There's so many layers to it.
It's really interesting. And, you know, I told you earlier I was recording about Psycho earlier in the day today.
Yeah.
And thinking about Mark and Norman Bates in the same room, essentially. He is obsessed with himself, but completely removed from himself. You know, considering that he's a serial killer of women and specifically targets women, specifically targets kind of sex workers as well, at least 2 in the film. He doesn't ever feel to me like a killer guided by sort of a hatred of women. It's more sort of a self-hatred about being looked at. So he's obsessed with being captured on screen and with how his father filmed him. But I think he's deeply afraid of being looked at, and the camera is kind of a way of being looked at, but indirectly. And being able to sort of review the way that people look at him, particularly women.
Yeah. And it's interesting that he, like, his whole I don't know, his bit is that he makes people look at themselves before he murders them.
Yeah.
And that adds a whole other layer to what Michael Powell was sort of doing here, was just kind of implicating himself as like forcing people to see inside of themselves in maybe an uncomfortable way.
I think that might have to do as well with like being the object of obsession, because he is in a way the object of obsession of his own father, who films him and kind of uses him as a guinea pig in a way, as a psychological guinea pig. It's like being I think sometimes about kind of child stars and kids who have grown up on social media in the same in the same way. You know, being a child who is being filmed and recorded and shown to a much bigger audience than anyone kind of usually is exposed to on a daily basis must do something to not just kind of how you function, what you consider to be performance versus, you know, reality. It has to fuck up your psychology in some way where you're like, just the act of being looked at all the time must be quite disturbing.
Oh, absolutely. But then also kind of you lose the self-awareness that is what ruined you, I guess. Because it doesn't, like, it seems like he wants to impose that fear on others as well.
Yeah. And how does he weaponize the camera? Both, you know, I mean, literally because he uses it to kill people, but also figuratively.
Well, I think it's sort of what we were talking about before. I see it as sort of like part of that metaphor. Like he's weaponizing the camera to turn all of our fears back on ourselves, to kind of make people feel like an object, to make them suddenly realize the exploitative nature of what they're participating in. Like, film is not just song and dance all the time. Sometimes it's horrifying, and it can do horrifying things. And to turn that dynamic back on these women, I suppose, and also turns it back on the audience itself. We're sort of implicated in that dynamic.
And this dynamic, I think, is kind of one of the things that really upsets people even today. You know, how does it complicate this idea of the gaze? Because it's us looking at Michael Powell, but also looking at Mark Lewis, who is looking at his victims, but also making his victims look in the mirror at themselves and through the camera at us, which sounds all very messed up, but I did make a diagram.
No, I followed you. First of all, I have to say that I'm absolutely obsessed with I don't remember what the term was, but he was like the morbid urge to gaze. I am obsessed with that.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. I mean, I think it really complicates it in the sense that we're following and sort of asked to sympathize with a gaze that we're not a fan of, shall I say. Like, this is a very disturbed man who's performing terribly violent acts. And typically, which I think is interesting to relate to Psycho, we're not necessarily put in his shoes. But here we are. We're kind of asked to sit in his life and understand his day-to-day and understand his psychology. And in some sense, it gives you a little sense of sympathy with him, even though we don't agree with what he's doing. We can kind of understand why it's happening. And I think that's a really disturbing thing and kind of complicates, I think, at that time, a traditional sense of point of view and the gaze. And so, yes, that's sort of why I think also that it was received very poorly initially, because that, I think, feels very new to me, being in the shoes of the villain.
Yeah, and we know, contrary to Psycho, where kind of the reveal of Norman is always strange and kind of menacing, but the reveal of him being the killer really comes at the end. He's certainly complicit in the murder from, in the middle when Marion is killed, but we don't know that he's actually the perpetrator. Whereas here, we're very much with Mark and his killings from the very first moment. And much like Norman Bates as well, he's also defined by the abuse of his parents, in this case his dad. How do you feel, and this is a little bit kind of thinking of the two films at the same time, how do you feel like this film shows us the psychology of Mark and how he suffered at the hands of his dad in particular.
The film is very revealing, and I mean, it's a really good device for kind of making that point really quickly. I think one of the things that I do actually prefer about this film than Psycho is that it's not done through exposition. There's a lot of exposition at the end of Psycho, which is kind of like, I'm telling you exactly how this went down. And what his psychology is and all of that. But with this, we kind of have to do a little interpretive work. And I think the seeds that are planted in that home movie that he shows Helen are really informative. So we see, the lizard being dropped and he's crying and he's seeing his mother on his deathbed or on her deathbed. And then, he's seeing like this couple kissing and it's like, what is that about, And so you kind of have to do a little bit of interpretive work on your own to think about how all of that will apply to what we're seeing him enact throughout the film. And it comes quite early on. So I think, we're sort of given these little hints that we then have to carry with us throughout the rest of the film and apply that.
It also
did that answer your question?
Yeah, and it also, I think, kind of it's very in line with how Powell and Pressburger approached cinema, where they really were after this idea of images and sound need to make the film. It's not so much about dialogue or exposition. It's about making the tools that you're given with filmmaking work for the story. So I agree with you, kind of it dispenses with the exposition that we get in Psycho. But then there's the added layer of Mark being able to literally rewatch how his father traumatized him over and over and over again, which he doesn't strictly comment on, but it is such a fucked up idea. Like, someone filming you being traumatized in real time and then you watching that over and over and over again,
right,
is such
and not
a
only
disturbing
that
thought. Yeah, go ahead.
But also, I mean, I think with a tip, and this is part of, I think, what goes to like sympathizing with him a little bit. It's like part of this, the typical serial killer's modus operandi is like hiding their crimes.
Yes.
With Psycho, for example, like he's putting the car in the swamp. He doesn't want anybody to find the car. And certainly this character does like hide himself to a certain extent. He doesn't want to be caught, but he knows he's going to be caught. And he's also like not hiding himself in like the easiest ways you could think of. So it's like, yes, this woman comes and asks to see his film. He could pick literally anything. I'm sure he has many other films that he could show her, but nope, he's going to show her the thing that he is absolutely obsessed with. Like this is a part of his psychology to the point where he can't even disguise what he's thinking about on a day-to-day basis. It is the only thing he thinks about. And it is sort of becoming, I think, part of an end game for him at this point.
I feel like you're right. And I do think that this shows up a little bit in serial killer narratives where there is, despite not wanting to be caught because they want to continue doing their killings, there is this desire to be seen, to be witnessed. And, the scene that I mentioned before where Mark shows his footage to Helen's blind mother is like the closest thing he can come to displaying himself in front of someone without being caught out completely because she can't see the footage.
Yeah. And she's the only one who kind of sees him anyway.
Yeah.
And she feels him.
She does. She senses kind of the strangeness and the menace in him. And what strikes you the most about Carl, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Carl Bohms? I'm going to say.
Boom? I don't know.
know. What strikes you the most about Carl Bohm's performance, with apologies to Carl Bohm?
I think he's wonderful in this film. It's funny because, he does have a little bit of a Peter Lorre vibe to him, just like a very handsome Peter Lorre.
Big eyes.
He's a very big eyes, breathy, understated voice, and just kind of like a menacing quality for like indescribable reasons. But he's kind of like a soft boy, and I think that's what lends itself to the film so well, is that, you know, he doesn't seem like the kind of person that you would meet like on the street or, you know, at work, who you would automatically be like, oh, a serial killer. But the more you talk to him, you're like, oh, I'm a little uneasy. So I think his performance is fantastic. It's very strange. It's very like off kilter, but at the same time, very gentle. And I like that balance that he really strikes. I think it's interesting that he's German, which is partly why I think he evokes Peter Lorre to me. But I like that it's just never explained. You know, he like grew up in this house in the UK, but he like looks and sounds like a deeply German person. So I think that kind of adds a strange layer to it that I'm sure would have probably been a little more charged at that time than it is now.
Well, this is one of the things that I find so fascinating about this film. I was talking earlier about Anthony Perkins and his boyish looks and how unsettling they become when he's playing Norman Bates, how he uses kind of his height and his like his charm to create this under layer of creepiness. And I think that Bohm here does the same thing, but kind of with his, you know, Germanic foreignness in a way. There is absolutely no reason why he's in this Austrian German born guy is in London.
Right.
Zero explanation. But I think kind of that slight lilt in his voice, that slight offness that's not British but not quite traceable or placeable, I find to be kind of one of the key reasons why it's unsettling. Not kind of because, oh no, he's a foreigner, so therefore he's spooky. It's more and I get the same very often. People can never tell where I'm from the way that I sound or the way that I look, and the combination of the two just weirds them out, kind of doesn't compute. And I think the same thing is being played up here with Mark, where it's like he could be from anywhere. Yeah, sure, he's from London, but is he really? And also maybe adds to this almost isolated nature of the character of like he sounds like someone who's not spoken to many people in his lifetime.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. For sure.
And also the fact that he's kind of looks like a fake prince, you know, when he played the emperor in the Sissy films.
Yeah, he totally has. He has like a weird, like continental nobility look.
Yes,
that is just, like weird to look at. I don't know.
It is. I find like very good looking people very unsettling in some ways.
Yeah,
you know, when you're looking at someone, it's like your features are too symmetrical. I don't like it. Like they're like, what's my entry
what is
point
your
here?
life like? I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't relate to you. Yeah,
it's like, let's, you know, can you have like, I don't know, something wrong with you so that there's some crack in the facade for me to relate.
But I think the difference is like some people that's really boring, like the boyfriend in Psycho. I'm like, you're so like stereotypically good looking that it's boring. And some people it's just like, oh, that's too much. Like, you know, when a dog has like blue eyes and you're like, no, you know, I'm just like that's not right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's just like off.
Yeah. And I do think that similarly to Norman Bates, kind of his generic continental European handsomeness is deceiving and plays a role in why people, particularly women, are so embracing of him, at least at the start. And I'm wondering kind of how do you think Mark picks his victims, and what does that tell us about how he views women?
Well, it's kind of never explained. I mean, I feel like the last one is an idea sort of out of convenience, or I guess the second two murders are kind of out of convenience because they're women that he has access to, and women that I guess would consent to spending time with him, so that it's easy to kind of put them in this situation. The first one I think is a little interesting because it comes seemingly out of nowhere. We don't really understand the motivation for it other than it's just kind of like a sex worker who I guess is also available but isn't really the same as the others. I think it's interesting that the last two murders are women who want to be on camera or who like it is their job to be seen and like are happy about that situation, and he kind of turns it on them and like uses their desires against them in a way. And then of course like contrasting that with Helen, who like asks him to leave the camera at home. She just wants to see him as him and is kind of makes fun of him when he brings his camera everywhere. So I don't know, I think it's never exactly explained, but I think that has something to do with it.
And how does Powell film the murders themselves?
Well, vaguely, I would say. In that we don't, it's not violent, I think, in the way that we think of slasher movies now, in the same way that Psycho is, although I think Psycho is more explicitly violent. You know, we don't see any like the knife entering anybody's body. It's not really explained until the last scene, really, what he's doing and how he actually murders these women. It's always kind of like a POV, right? Like we're in the eye of the camera. We see these women through like a literal crosshairs of the camera, kind of edging toward them. We see their fear. We see what Carl would be seeing as his actor, but whatever. And then it kind of fades away or it cuts to another scene. We never actually get to experience like the bad part. We just see the buildup, what he's trying to see.
Yeah, but it's weird that the way that this film imprints itself on your mind actually makes you remember the murder scenes, even though we cut away before it actually happens. And you know, we alluded to before that this film was very badly received. What was the contemporary reaction to the film when it came out, and how do you think it's been reassessed since then?
Well, from my understanding, I mean, it was thrashed by critics. I read somewhere that I don't think there was like a single contemporary review that was remotely positive. I mean, they were calling it immoral, disgusting, truly like, enter terrible term here. I'm sure it was lobbed at that film. And as you mentioned, it sort of ended Michael Powell's career in the UK. He was able to, go to Australia, and I think he made a film later with Helen Mirren. But that was kind of it. And I think that's kind of shocking, honestly. In terms of its reassessment, I think it has a lot to do with Scorsese, no? I know that he personally he was a huge fan of Powell and Pressburger, of course, and personally paid to have a print of it shown at the New York Film Festival. And I think it's one of those things where like prints of it have kind of been going around for a while, and then eventually it was restored and kind of has been made available more recently. So, it just seems like it's taken this really crazy journey that led it to like kind of the underground is one of those things that, it was banned. So everybody has to see it now.
Yeah. It was incredibly vitriolic. It was incredibly vitriolic how people reacted to it. When I was researching the film for another thing I had to do for the Blu-ray 4K re-release of it in the UK, I was reading how critics walked out at the press screening in March 1960 when it was screened for critics, and someone, the Observer's film critic, grabbed her bag, loudly screamed, "I'm sickened," and walked out. And she did review the film, even though she walked out of it. And she said that she wrote that, "I don't propose to name the players in this beastly film."
Wow.
And like another critic for the Sunday Times called it essentially vicious. Other critics called it like the sickest and filthiest films they could remember seeing. It was like pretty much taken out of distribution because the reaction was so aggressive to it.
Right. Do you have a sense of how audiences reacted to it as well? I mean, like, were audiences as harsh on it as critics were in the UK?
Well, I think
before it was taken out of distribution.
I think not that many people got to see it because it was so violently rejected by critics, but also it was classified X by the BBFC, which is kind of the censorship body. I mean, it's sort of evolved out of that since, but it was at that time. And they did cut the film, particularly 7 scenes, the more violent ones. So I don't think it actually got a proper release, and it served even as a warning to Hitchcock, who refused to screen Psycho for the press and just straight up released it in cinemas, because he didn't want a repeat of what had happened with Peeping Tom and the film being killed before it was ever distributed properly in cinemas.
Right. Here's something that I'm interested in. I'm wondering what your perspective on it is as someone who like lives in the UK. I have the sense that American audiences are more tolerant of depictions of violence historically than British audiences are. And I'm wondering if you think that has anything to do with the receptions of Psycho and Peeping Tom. I think there are probably like some textual reasons why, I think. But I'm wondering, like, because obviously Psycho was so well received, especially in the United States. I think it was Hitchcock's most popular film to that point.
It was, yeah.
And so, I'm really interested in that difference.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I actually always thought that American audiences were more, pearl clutchy than generally speaking European audiences. I know that the UK is not part of Europe anymore, but I am.
Well,
so.
I think we are. I think we are with sex. I think we're more pearl clutchy with sex, but we love a violent movie. Yeah. So I don't know.
I do. I was looking at it because when I rewatched it most recently, I was already kind of, had been living in London for a while, and I was wondering if it would feel different because of this new relationship I have with this place and kind of British people. Yeah. And actually, I think the part of it that struck me the most, and this is again viewing it from foreign eyes, from, like an adopted Brit as opposed to a British person.
Yeah.
It's very concerned with sex without there ever being a sex scene. It's very concerned with peeping, with voyeurism in a sexual way as well as a kind of artistic way. And I think that's uncomfortable for definitely for the time for Brits. Yeah. But I think there's also a part of it that is it might be fundamentally upsetting to a very class obsessed country, which is, this is a well-to-do, upstanding young man who is a homeowner. He's a landlord in the film.
Passive income, the scariest part of the film.
But it was a thing that I completely did not even pick up on when I watched the film as a student, and then kind of a bunch of times since then. But I was like, oh my God, he is a nice white British boy that doesn't look or sound British, but he's the right kind of,
weird looking, wealthy young man. The fact that he's independently wealthy, he's kind of quiet, he rents out his place, he owns his own place. It's like he should not be the villain, because him being a serial killer so disturbed throws up something that I think British audiences definitely at the time would not be prepared to consider even as a possibility. It's like saying, you know, the call is coming from inside the house. It's like, oh, what do you mean? We not the filthy immigrants, not you know, the poor, we can do this? Absolutely not. Disgusting, filthy, unacceptable.
That totally makes sense. Well, and I also think it kind of goes to, or it speaks to something about Powell and Pressburger's work as well that kind of has always unsettled British audiences in that way. Like, I think a lot of their films kind of did get a weird reception at home, no? For example, I know The Red Shoes was received far less well there than it was in America. Yeah. And partly because we're not reading some of those cultural specificities into it that I think he would have been specifically commenting on. I mean, I think a lot about the film that he's working on, that he's filming in the movie, where you have this kind of like ditzy actress, and like, you know, there was a murder, but they're still very concerned about like getting in on time and staying under budget and all of these things that are just kind of so bizarre to think about. But that's the kind of film that would have been really popular at that time in the UK. And he's kind of saying, isn't it silly? Isn't this kind of dumb? So to kind of like parody a class distinction, but also kind of implicating them as being like, yeah, we're working on all these films for you. And they're bad. Look how horrible this is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of definitely more of a kind of, oh, this is more an industry dig than, you know,
totally.
That wouldn't mean much to an audience. But it certainly would mean it would be a slap in the face of the critics who would give all of these films great reviews. Right. But there, I think kind of alongside that, there's also that thing of, as I've been watching these films and kind of seeing the patterns emerge since very early on, there is no good ending. As in, you know, at the end of Psycho, Norman Bates is captured. He is deemed, you know, insane and kind of not in control of his actions, which, you know, debatable. But there is a thing of justice and authority has prevailed, and he's now safely behind bars and everything is back to normality. But actually, if you think about it, no matter how grotesque it is, Mark completes his vision. You know, the thing he always wanted to do was to film the act of death and to see himself in that sense. And he accomplishes that. So in a way, I think there's a really disturbing element to it where the killer, the antagonist, the villain wins because he gets to do the thing that he wanted to do. He gets to complete his mad vision.
That's true. It is kind of a have your cake and eat it too thing, where Michael Powell gets to have the most messed up ending he can imagine, but also kind of satisfy the like tradition of good guy wins. Because yes, he completes his vision, but he also dies. So we're safe and it's all good.
Yeah, we're safe, but also we feel kind of gross.
But also, oh God. Yeah. Oh no.
Do you think that kind of, you know, even now, even by, you know, when we started this chat and you were talking about how you've seen it for the first time recently and it's kind of stuck in your brain since then, at the time it was decried as sleazy, as perverted, as filthy. Do you think it has, despite it being a masterpiece, yada yada, do you think it still has that element of sleaze even now?
like, yes and no. I mean, I think when they're calling it sleazy and perverted, I think they mean cheap and exploitative, like in a derogatory sense. I see it as perverted in like how audacious it is about exploring the truth of these dynamics. Like it's perverted in how the lengths it goes to like disturb us, you know. But I don't think it's done in a way that feels cheap or exploitative, which is, I think, how they must have seen it. And again, like, I do think like all of these dynamics are like a little bit perverse, aren't they? You know, like I was thinking of a lot about, weirdly, films that talk about these subjects with actors. So like May December was in my head while I was watching this, you know.
Okay, yeah.
Just Natalie Portman's character like digging into this woman's horrible psychology to embody her, and like, isn't that a little perverse? Isn't that a little exploitative? Isn't that strange? Or like A Double Life. I don't know if you've seen from the 40s, where I think it's kind of like a little bit like a precursor to making fun of method acting before method acting, where it's like, oh, you know, you can become so a part of this character that you become as messed up as this character, and you like get the same impulses, and maybe that can be dangerous. It can consume you in that way. And so like, like it is perverse, but in a good way, I think.
And where do you think Mark Lewis stands in, you know, and maybe this is just a comparison between him and Norman Bates, but kind of because they happen to be unwilling brothers, really. Where do you think he stands in the legacy of this kind of serial killer in cinema?
Oh, wow. I mean, I feel that's more for you to answer than me, since you have a much better grasp on this topic than I do.
I think that
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, I'm trying. That's why I'm watching all these movies. But it's really, I think both him and Norman Bates are the start of a very morbid fascination with the psychology of the serial killer, more so than their actions. Their actions are kind of the fodder of true crime and, you know, all of that kind of more non-fiction world. And there's been plenty of real life killers that have inspired fictional ones. But I think the amount of time that is given to their background, to their background as children, and to the abuses that they suffered as children, very different. And to how those have translated themselves into kind of these very perverse fantasies that culminate in murder is like, you can just, they're kind of like at the top of this tree of, you know, let's figure out how a killer thinks and through the things that he does and what happened to him. And it's usually a him. But it's interesting. I was talking about The Night of the Hunter earlier today, and that is also an early serial killer movie in a way, but absolutely gives us nothing. This is a guy that just drops out of nowhere, completely fully formed, completely, you know, made serial killer, and you get very little insight into who he was, why he's doing the things he's doing. Did something happen to him? No, just evil. And here we kind of get quite a lot of time devoted to why they're a killer.
Totally. I mean, you can see the reflections of that today too. Again, I mean, well, I think I'm not to harp too much on being an American, but obviously we have a lot of problems with mass violence in this country, and every time, I mean, I think the press is getting better about this, but it's what happened to him at home. What was going on with him? People say he was a disturbed young man. Like, tell us the details of, you know, what was he searching online? What kind of animals was he like torturing as a child? Like all of these things that have just kind of become hallmarks, like both cinematically and in real life. And it's like hard to even know what the chicken and egg situation is there. But that feels extremely relevant to the way, I mean, all of these series too, like, you know, what are they, like a Jeffrey Dahmer TV series now? I mean, I didn't watch any of these, but
yeah, there was I'm sorry.
Do those grow out of this to you?
Well, I think they're both serial killer horror and psychological horror and true crime are parallel tracks to one another, and sometimes they intersect, particularly lately. And the Dahmer series, which I as a consumer of this sort of stuff, I've found very distasteful. And I rarely do.
Oh, same. That's why I was like, I can't watch this.
Yeah, I really sure I left it after a few episodes and then reluctantly kind of finished it for something that I had to do or something. And I just kept the entire series. I had it at an arm's length because I was so disturbed by the way they chose to film Dahmer, the character. And also the very cynically smart release tactics around it. But I think that's a perversion of what Powell was trying to do here and what Hitchcock was doing in Psycho.
Totally.
It's interested in, it's not interested in the why. It's kind of really reveling in the how.
Totally. But I think that what's interesting about it is, like, I think this film is exploring the psychology of like how those things get made, like the morbid urge to gaze, like people eat it up. And isn't that kind of gross? Like, isn't that kind of disgusting? And yet it's like one of the most popular genres in the world right now. You know?
But also it's this kind of this, you know, I really hesitate to call it kind of gross because I am one of those people. And it's a constant thing of like, why do I want to know about this? You know, is this a phase? You know, I've been asking guests on this series, like, did you have a serial killer phase where you were engaged with this sort of stuff? Did you grow out of it? What made you grow out of it? Did you stop? Some people don't. It's a huge industry now. And there's multiple layers to it. It's not really a true crime podcast, this one, but when it's fictionalized, and that's why I find it interesting because there's a lot less obligation to a truth there.
Yes.
You're creating a story, you're creating characters, which means that these are deliberate choices that you're making for reasons.
Right.
And when you're choosing to film, say, Jeffrey Dahmer as like lifting weights and sweating and dancing around and being genuinely very hot because he's played by a very hot actor, it's like you're making choices that have nothing to do with the story or
it ruins the distance.
Exactly that. And you're indulging in the morbid urge to gaze and mixing it with other urges that are not morbid, but that become morbid because you're making people lust after a real life serial killer. So that's when it gets weird for me.
Absolutely. And I think that is part of what like Michael Powell adds to this film that I think makes the initial reception of it so strange to me, is like as much as it is delving into like probably very real psychology to me, or like realistic in a sense, like so much about his filmmaking in general is unreal. The way that he lights things, the way that he frames things. So it does preserve that distance. It doesn't make it feel like you're watching a documentary about a real person in any sense. So you're just kind of, I think it, that's why I think it is actually tastefully done, even if it remains perverse or like sleazy or however we want to talk about it in that way.
And I think, that it very knowingly uses its lead actors, you know, Bohm in this case and Perkins in the case of Psycho, to really use who they are as performers as well as you know, their physicality to really interrogate how we're experiencing them on screen. instead of just creating a thirst trap.
Yes.
But yeah, we've devolved into
Anthony Perkins looks very menacing.
Yes, but also in a weird, oh, I can probably take him, but then suddenly, oh no, I can't. I most definitely cannot.
Right. Absolutely.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to say about Peeping Tom that's been on your mind that we haven't covered?
Oh gosh. Let me look through my notes. Holy fuck. Oh, the decision of Michael Powell to play the father and have his son play the son, wild. Wild.
Yes.
Obsessed with it. That's cool. So crazy.
Obsessed with the fact that the son is now featured as a talking head in every single Peeping Tom documentary that's ever made, saying that he was fine. Actually, it was all good fun.
Yeah. He's like, I'm not traumatized, you guys. It was a good experience.
Did knowing that change your view of the film or of Powell as a filmmaker or the themes he's exploring in any way?
Well, it just made it more, because I think it just confirmed for me how intentional it was about exploring these issues. Like I knew that he didn't write it. So to some extent you're just like, oh, how much is he saying this versus the screenwriter? But then when he kind of literally puts himself in that position, you're like, oh no, he very specifically is trying to say these things. This is about him exploring something for himself that's very personal. It wasn't just a screenplay that was handed to him because he couldn't get his Freud movie going. There's something very specific about it that resonated with him. So yeah, it was more of like underlining everything that I was suspecting about the film in that moment.
It's a very revealing tidbit about Peeping Tom.
Yeah. Did that change how you saw it when you saw it for the first time?
I didn't learn this fact until like way later on, and it did make me watch the film a little bit more trepidatiously, but more, there was nothing untoward happening, but it did add this additional layer of, for lack of a better word, kind of meta-ness or intertextuality, where I'm like, oh, right, yes, you definitely want us to be thinking about what is happening between you, the camera, the character, the audience. Like that is a circle jerk that is happening throughout this entire movie of we're looking at someone, look at us through the camera, looking at the people. Like that is the circular obsession of Peeping Tom, and the fact that Powell films his own son as Mark, whereas Mark's dad filming Mark, adds to that. I think it's like a very smart additional kind of piece of information. Doesn't take away anything. If you don't know anything, you don't need to know this, but it just adds that extra layer when you do find out.
Yeah, I love what you said about circular obsession, because I feel like that's a really good way of describing like most of what Michael Powell works on. Like all of these things feel so interconnected with each other. Like the idea of obsession. I mean, thinking about Black Narcissus, and you have the kind of sexual obsession and like perversion that's happening there, and like God forbid that man doesn't want to like kill a redhead or something, in one film. There's just so many like recurring instances of these things happening that you're just like, wow, he had really something going on upstairs.
Yeah, and even with something like the red shoes, which you mentioned earlier, like Lermontov's obsession with crafting the perfect dancer. The perfect dancer who would completely devote herself to the dance and to his vision of ballet is kind of the same impulse, just manifested differently, as Mark trying to create the perfect movie or the perfect murder or or capture a perfect moment of fear.
Have you seen different versions of this screenplay? Because I am curious how much it changed from like first draft that was shown to Michael Powell to what was eventually filmed.
I haven't seen versions of the screenplay. Have you dove into it?
No, I haven't, but I would be really curious about it because it is strange how neatly it slots into his filmography, I guess. You know, like it feels like something that he would have come up with on his own, even if it's not.
Yeah, but I wonder as well if the story was there. And actually the screenwriter for Peeping Tom is a very interesting figure. It's on YouTube actually. There's a documentary called A Very British Psycho. Which is all about the making of Peeping Tom, and he does talk to camera a lot, and I have no idea whether he's fibbing for most of the time because he has like a whole backstory.
He's creepy too.
Yeah, he's got very dark energy.
I was like, you are Edgar Allan Poe as a person. Like I was very turned off by him. But he has a cool life. I don't know.
Well, it sounds cool, but also it sounds made up.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if you saw the John le Carre documentary, the Errol Morris documentary, The Pigeon Tunnel. So that is basically a one-on-one conversation between Errol Morris and John le Carre talking about his life, his books, his experiences in MI5 or MI6, one of those, and how that inspired his spy novels. And all throughout that documentary, I kept getting just this very intense chill from le Carre, where I'm like, I know you're not truthful. And that might make you, that's probably what's made you a brilliant novelist and also an effective spy or whatever. But I got the same vibe, which is nothing more than that, from the screenwriter of Peeping Tom in that documentary, where I'm like, I know this is not it. I don't have any evidence, but I don't trust your chronology, what you're saying. I don't trust that any of what you're talking about is true.
Yeah, it's super bizarre. Argyle vibes.
One day someone will make a film or a documentary kind of digging into the truth. Yeah, Peeping Tom exposed. But Izzy, thank you so much for your time and for your insight on this. It's been a real pleasure.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I always have fun chatting with you.
Never a chore. Thanks again.